good to know you can switch it around even in live situations. But yeah, so I've been thinking about, I said I was going to do something about this. And this is a document, a handout that was given to Evergreen for the group that was going to go off campus in their day of absence. So yeah, this is entitled White Supremacy Culture. That's why you have the thumbnail. I took a picture of the actual handout. I actually printed it out, which I hate printing things out. It's a waste of paper. Poor little tree sacrificed itself for white supremacy culture. Fuck. Anyways, now there are some couple things, and just so you know, this is actually a group. Let's see if I can get this up. You see, I'm sort of doing this because I want you people to frigging know when I talk about this crap. But I'm talking. No one that I'm aware of has actually been talking about this. But there is an actual group. I went to the website and just confirm where they were coming from, what the thinking is. And I really should talk to someone who actually went to this event at Evergreen State College. But this got me really thinking about culture. Now, I came up with this term, race does not a culture make, about maybe half a year ago, maybe a year ago, because I started thinking about, well, what defines a culture? But what I didn't really do is explain what it is a culture. So to say race is not a culture make, what does a culture make? What is culture composed of? And as it turns out, culture is composed of three basic possibilities. One is, now I'm drawing a blank here. We have geography, language, and values. So geography is pretty self-explanatory. Language, again, pretty self-explanatory. But values can be sort of weird in that you can have a scientific value, so that you could be a part of a scientific community because you value scientific thought. Or it could be religious, Christianity. Or it could be silly like Minecraft or games. Because even in gaming culture, there are subcultures within gaming cultures. Now, how you are defined as a person really will be complicated. So there isn't like one type of gaming or one type of community, but many different. So when I say the end of black culture, to really get beyond where we are at this stage in racial discussions, what I'm trying to say is that we need to put an end to talking about race as a cultural fact. Race is not what makes your culture. Now, it is true, it is what they call corollary, often will be related to a culture. Someone's chatting with me, and thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying this content. What I'm trying to articulate here is that we have gotten into the habit of allowing people to think like, well, I'm a part of a black culture, or looking at someone and saying they are a member of the black culture. We should have never really encouraged that kind of thinking, because what it does is it undermines values and the common language we may share. Now, if you come from an inner city community, there may be a specific community relation to that, and there may be a high correlation with the fact that most of the people from that community are black. So just mentioning the community, people may assume that you're black because that is the community that we know of, like somewhere east side Chicago. I've never been there, so I don't know if it truly is a black, predominantly black community. But that is the ideology that we're not fighting against. Now, here's a really weird thing about this particular document. Now, it goes through and it talks about perfectionism. And it says all the things that I'm going to be listing here is a part of this ideology of white supremacy culture. And perfectionism is a problem. It's a problem in any community that wants to be perfect. In terms of perfectionism in your work, in terms of having everything to be just perfect, it can be oppressive. There definitely is a form of oppression in terms of other people, in terms of yourself, and you can do it in a lot of different ways. So this here is, so the first part of it is perfectionism. Now, I don't have necessarily a problem with the conclusion in terms of they do like anecdotes, develop a culture of appreciation when organizing, take time to make sure people's work and efforts are appreciated. That's a good idea in terms of if you are trying to create a community of people, meaning it's just you want to appreciate the people around you. If you look at free speech, for example, one of the reasons free speech is so important is it's a way of valuing the people that have differing opinions, and you don't expect them to have the same opinions. So there's a lot of irony in terms of the antidotes in their description here. And that's another reason why I wanted to discuss with them, how is this description of perfectionism and this antidote related to each other? A lot of people think that, and this is another irony of this. Now, perfectionism was one, and that's on the first page. And I don't know what page this is on because I printed it. This is page 5, apparently. But fear... Okay, check that out. Fear of open conflict. Now, for me, this is like mirror image. I don't know why they do this mirror image thing, but they do. I'm doing this from the iPad, and that's why I like it. I can do it quickly. But fear of open conflict. Now, how is that a part of white supremacist culture? I don't get it. So they accuse their labeled white supremacist culture of being afraid of open conflict, and then Evergreen students demonstrate a lack of wanting to be in dialogue. They demonstrate open conflict, but they have no means by which to resolve open conflict. Let's see if this helps. No, that doesn't help. Okay, that might help a little bit in terms of reading this too. So, fear of open conflict. And another thing that really kind of struck me was individualism. So there's an attack on individualism. Progress is bigger and more. So it's an open. So this document is a attack on modern culture. And there's things you can say about progress as being just bigger and more, but we live, if you want a quality of life for everyone, the way our economy is structured, and I don't know any other way to structure an economy, certainly socialism hasn't worked. So what are you suggesting? That we should go back to socialism? And that's when people accuse the Evergreen students of advocating for socialism, and this program clearly is clearly talking about the values of socialism and not valuing capitalism, because really individualism, we value the individual because we want them to be invested in their property, in their products, and that's why we value the individual, not because groups aren't important. It's because we want to make sure that the groups are composed of individual people, not people that feel a need to be a part of a collective. And that's why I wanted to get out on this, because it's very regressive in terms of putting down individualism. Paternalism. And this is the whole thing of power structure, talking about how everything is a matter of power structure. And it's depressing to see that they continually frame things in terms of their power structure instead of a functional structure. Because you can look at things as being functional. Which is more important, the engine of the car or the wheels of the car? So that would be a functional perspective of the dynamics of a community, of the interrelatedness of a community. Now, you can live without lights, but you understand the function that the lights have. It's an added security, it's added visibility, it's a very clear demonstration of function. You can't really, it's not better or worse than the wheels or the engine, but it's a part of, and it makes the whole experience better by having lights. So instead of looking at things as a hierarchical structure, as more important, less important, if you look at things from a functional standpoint, you can actually see how things work together. So what this document is actually doing is it's undermining the functions that people have in society by simply putting people on a linear scale of power and lack of power. So if we look at racism as power and lack of power, we're missing just a very functional aspect of people. Race is something you're born with. You can't do anything. Eye color is an example. Could be, we could grade people by their eye color. Blue eyes versus brown eyes. Whatever you want to do. Green eyes. You could value one over the other, or not value it at all. That's up to you. But why would you want to gear your society around racial qualities? Or why would you call a culture racial? So I encourage people, when they try to draw you into, are you a member of a black culture? Are you a member of a white culture? Basically, the answer is no. I'm an American, or I'm a Washingtonian, or I'm a Nevadan, or whatever your geographic, maybe your language, maybe your... but remember, 3 categories of culture, basic categories of culture: geography, language, and values. So you can have a Minecraft culture. That's a legitimate statement to make. You can have a gaming community or gaming culture. But, and that culture is going to be nuanced. But these are valid cultures. A race isn't the foundation for a culture, and we shouldn't include that. Now, it would be true to say an African culture, or you could say some sort of tribal culture, but so many of the people that in the United States have been here so long, and the only thing they have of the African culture is the color of their skin. I mean, everything else about them, perhaps some mannerisms that are a part of genetics, but for the most part, they're Americans. And we're all Americans. And here's to show you how racism, how systemic this racial idea is. If you have a class predominantly, I don't think it even matters if it's predominantly white or predominantly black. It wouldn't matter. But you ask all the students, and they privately write down, describe yourself. In the United States, the majority of black students will use their skin tone, their color of skin, as being a part of their identity. The majority of white students won't. Now, this is just a fact. What we do with that fact is really a matter of what we understand about race. If I am, as a white person, I don't think of myself as a white culture, right? Has nothing to do with my culture. In fact, I was discussing this in Portland with a Black Lives Matter protester, and he understood what I was saying when I said, I know you by your language. And I hadn't completely formulated the geography, language, values, culture. I've been working on it and realizing that is something that we're not teaching. We're not teaching people what culture is. We made a huge mistake when we said we allowed this idea of black culture to pervade the American culture. And it's just an idea, and it's not a good descriptor of culture. But the point here is, be aware when someone uses terms like black culture, they're undermining themselves and they're creating a problem between other racial groups. Racism, the systemic racism that we see at Evergreen, for example, was caused by, in part, the day of absence. This ideology that we need a day of absence undercuts integration. And I don't mean integration in the sense that you have to become my culture. We can create our own special cultures. We should be moving towards a culture. Who do we want to be, not who we are? Some guy keeps clicking on and off the like, unlike button. That's hilarious. Just had to point that out. I'm like, that's real time, dude. I can see that. Anyways, I thought that was funny. But, so that's what we're looking for in how we deal with cultures. So, just be very leery of people when they talk about white supremacist culture. Like button trolling. I'll call that the new like button trolling while live streaming. No, just kidding. But that's a problem with doing things live, is things are distracting and you don't get the chance to edit. But I do want to be able to do things live. There was another idea I wanted to get across, and I'm sort of going through this to see if it had something to do with it. There's a book called Imagine, and in the book, about racial identity as a part of individualism, you can identify as being black if you want, but I would say that's not a good identity. I wouldn't encourage that identity. I would say then you're missing what really makes a culture. Now, you may think that's a part of your culture, but it's really not. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think, it doesn't really have a functional, it's like the color of a car. The color of a car is red, blue, or green, but it doesn't have a functional aspect to the car, right? A car can have power windows. That's a part of the culture of the car. So if you look at it from a functional standpoint, how is your color functional to your culture? So that's why I say it's not a part of culture. Even if you find people that are in a community and they're predominantly black, that's not their culture. Their values, their geography, and their language are going to be what makes that culture. And you can even look at inner city culture. You know, white kids can be very much a part of the black culture because it's predominantly black. And so they pick up on the language and they pick up on the behaviorisms. Now, they may be an outcast of that culture, but they're still very much a part of that culture from an ideological sense. And I'd say they probably discriminated against more than if they were black, because the culture discriminates against white people because it's a part of their culture. Function as, okay, somebody's, it's only as functional as far as society makes. It's only as functional as society makes of it. Yes, you can create an artificial, you can make an artificial variable in black, so you can make it a factor in a culture, right? So you can discriminate based upon the color of someone's skin. And that's what I say, it's a bad idea to do that. You can do it, but is that something you really want to do? And I think it's a bad idea. And it does create racial tension. So you're creating a problem for society. We can change the color of a car, but at this stage of the game, we can't change the color of a person. But would we want to? Would we want to make that a big deal? So I would say no. Now, we're largely creating our own cultures. You know, every generation creates their own culture. And if you look from a learning standpoint, the majority of people, not majority of people, but young people, who they become is largely determined by their peers, not their parents. Now, this is a very strange fact, but, you know, in terms of peer pressure is a lot more than parental pressure. Genetics and parental pressure are the two primary accountability of what you become and what values you have. Those are more important than direct parental influence. Now, of course, because parents share similar genes, they're going to have characteristics. You're going to share a lot of phenotypical characteristics, but any cultural characteristics will primarily be about what are the causes of IQ between. Well, that's the question was, if you're not reading, just listening, but what is the difference between Asian, white IQ? And the thing is, there's some variance in all culture, right? So you can say by taking a self-identified group of Asians, a self-identified group of whites, and comparing their IQ scores, and you'll find that the average IQ of Asians is higher than the average IQ of white people. But the difference between individuals within the one group are greater than the difference of the group average as a whole. So you can't really predict what someone's IQ is going to be simply upon their race. So you still want to base people's intelligence on their individual achievement, not upon the racial achievement. So it would be a really bad idea to select based upon race. Now, I could throw some other statistical games you could play, but IQ tests and IQ tests are very disputed concepts. They are very disputed concepts. One of the things, as a person with a learning disability, if you want to get diagnosed with a learning disability, you use IQ tests. And there's a disparity on certain IQ markers, whether it be functional reasoning or language skills. Now, and you have to have a disparity of 2 standard deviations between those two areas, because the majority of the IQ tests are designed so that there's very little deviation between each subgroup of an IQ test. I can't remember right now. Spatial reasoning, language. Help me out if you remember all of the groups right now. I don't remember all the groups, but so you need a disparity between those groups to be diagnosed with a learning disability. Now, dyslexics will point out there's some advantages to being slow in one group and fast in another group, and there's a book called The Dyslectic Advantage. I sometimes refer to it when people want to really look at IQ from a different perspective, from actually how it might give you an advantage, especially if you're dealing with someone with dyslexia. What's the most effective way to help them? And that's to identify their strengths and how to leverage their strengths. So you really want tests to be individualized. And one of the frustrations I have with educational systems is we don't individualize classes for students. Like, give them tests, find out kind of where their strengths are, where their interests are, and kind of gear their schooling based on their interests and based upon their strengths. It's not that you don't want to fill in some of those gaps, but you might want to attack those problems differently based upon their strengths. Now, I'm reading a book on genes, and I got to a section that was talking about emotional strengths. And there's a gene for emotional fragility. But what's interesting about that particular gene, the H something gene, but people with that gene may be more emotional fragile, but they're also more responsive to socialization. So, meaning that you can do social intervention to make them more resilient. And the analogy that's given in the book is the difference between an orchid and a daisy, or what's a yellow flower? Is that the daisy? I'm going to say daisy. So orchids needing special attention, special environments. Daisies, just whatever you do, they just grow the same, right? So we can see, we already have genetic markers with differences in people, and we can test for this both with genetic testing and probably with psychological testing, might be able to distinguish whether someone is fragile in a specific way. So how do you gear your society? Should you gear your society based upon should a culture be based on race? I say it isn't. It hasn't been. Now, the reason and this is the point that I wanted to bring up, the reason I got into this and really wanted to do this video is the mouthy Buddha, who did an interesting song, but he also talked about racial differences and white nationalism. And the same argument would apply to them. I said, I don't want to live in a society segregated upon a racial phenotype. Now, would I prevent you from doing that? No. Would I argue against it? Yes, which is what I'm doing now. I don't think you'll find it to be a superior culture. In fact, one of the great advantages of interracial marriages is the genetic advantage in terms of the strengthening of the genetic offspring. A lot of genetic diseases tend to be recessive genes. And the more biologically diverse you are, the less likely that two recessive genes will match up. So that's kind of a generic advantage, but it is an advantage. And there may be cultural differences that may make your marriage more difficult. But from a strengthening biological, there's very good reasons why you wouldn't want to have a single race family. It would be better to have a multiracial family because it gives you a stronger genetic background. So, people are concerned about a monoculture, which I think is sort of not something we need to worry about. And this comes into a cultural appropriation. Israel, how the average Hispanic population has more health problems than Asians. I don't know. I know they're more reproductive. At least I was told that they're more reproductive. I don't know why they have more health. Now you have to follow up question on that, because is it related to if they're breeding together in terms of Hispanics? What's the advantage of if they breed? Talking about breeding people right now. What happens if interracial marriages, like a Hispanic man marries a gringo woman? You can look at it a couple different ways. So where are those health problems? I thought they were healthier, quite frankly. I'm trying to think. You'd have to be very specific, because there are many environmental causes to health problems too. So is it a genetic, or is it primarily a an environmental cause? Genetic diseases is all over. The only difference is how well those populations are represented in research. Yeah. That's a part of it, right? That's definitely a part of it, is how well they're represented in research. differences between races of genetic disease. Well, all groups have the potential to have genetic problems, but some will have different ones. And I'm talking specifically about interracial genetics. And I don't have that on my fingertips, what that is. That's true, but if you are a part of, you'll get less of, right, and that's why the recessives don't match up, is because you have the recessive gene for one disease and they have a recessive gene for another, you'll match up. Now, are you introducing long-term diseases into the gene pool that would have been, it gets complicated really fast. The book, again, I'm going to refer back to the book I'm reading, called Genes. It's a recent book written. You can look it up online, but highly recommended because the author really goes into. We're already engaged in eugenics, whether we know it or not, because as soon as you select for genes, like you do an amniocentesis, which a lot of parents are doing, you automatically have a list of potential diseases that your child might have. So you make the decision, do I want to have this child with this disease? And what he does is he says, okay, schizophrenia is a horrible thing to happen, but look at the geniuses we've had. And of course, A Beautiful Mind, Professor Nash, what he gave to society. So is perfectionism what we're after? So it is a very important. What do we mean by normal? What do we mean by perfectionism? And diversity, both of thought and of genetics, is probably a very healthy thing. So that's why I remind people to think about it that way. I believe in diversity because I think there is value in having that diversity. Now, and I believe it's demonstratable. Now, is extreme diversity necessary? Well, extreme diversity could be very chaotic. So there's a balancing line between diversity and not diversity. I think you're agreeing with me in the governments and stuff like that. And well, one of the interesting things about the collapse in 2008 of the markets was because of the formulas they were using. They were correct, but it was because it was, from their perspective, was statistically impossible for the conditions to crash the markets to occur. But because of what they were doing, the feedback cycle pushed it further and further to that crash scenario, which was under historical data was impossible. But the feedback and the way the feedback system was working, and because they were introducing behaviors based upon that statistical model, they created the very scenario they were was not statistically possible to create. So we got to be really concerned about feedback cycles. So you don't necessarily know what a feedback cycle will do, meaning what is the strategy given the feedback that you're creating in a system. So systems can crash because of the information you're reacting to. And I'm trying to think of a good example as I'm spitting out this basic premise. Well, let's go back to the racism and how treating the culture, well, it's the same thing, either with sexism or racism. If you oppress people, your goal is not to oppress people, but you can inadvertently oppress people by encouraging a strategy of oppression. self-oppression, self-censorship, sort of like, okay, I'll do this so I can be a victim. So this is the argument against the victim culture, is aren't you oppressing the person if you're not giving them the agency to be a racist, for example, the power plus race argument. I can't be a racist if I'm black because I don't have the power, which is then you're undermining them as human beings. You're saying, well, because you're black, you can't be a racist. Well, yes, I can. I can do anything, right? Well, you can't be racist because you're black. That would be really weird. But that's basically what you're saying. So you're taking away agency from them, their ability to be a racist. So the feedback cycle is you can't be a racist, therefore no matter what I do, I become a racist. Well, not no matter what I do, but there's basically an encouragement to become a racist because there's no inhibition for you not to be a racist. This is why I believe we have a really high degree of people that are black that are racist, because the inclination that a white person would get would be inhibiting, whereas when a black person does it, we go, oh, whoa, that's weird. Is that a black thing? Should I know something about that? And that's our reaction to it. And I can consciously, I was thinking about that thinking process of, well, that's a black person, but that's really racist. Why do they do that? They do it because there's no inhibition for them to do it. It's like women don't hit a woman. Well, okay, we shouldn't hit anyone, but if you don't hit women, then they will feel when they hit somebody and they don't get hit back. I'm not encouraging hitting, just get me straight here. But if you don't hit them back, they will feel it's okay to hit you. So women may not hit very strong, they might not have a hard punch, but they're still hitting people. This is a behavior that by the very nature of you not inhibiting that behavior will encourage the behavior, because there's a tendency to hit within the human gene pool. Now that tendency is probably lower in women than it is in men, but it wouldn't matter because you're inhibiting it in men, but you're not inhibiting it in women. So you get a very interesting reaction to that. And that's what I would say of the feedback cycles. How are we encouraging a specific behavior by projecting out what is okay and what's not okay? And this is the thing when we look at Evergreen specifically, and social sciences in general, we haven't had the feedback cycle for people to inhibit bad thinking. And I have one of the examples, me personally, when I was going to college, I took the scientific method, thinking straight about psychology, and one of the questionnaires he did early on in the class was, what's the most scientific science? And people listed it: physics, chemistry, biology, and at the bottom was social science. And I said, well, it's a bad question. Science is science. It's independent of the science you're studying. So when I told him that after the class, he was a little taken aback, but he recognized that that was a valid interpretation of science. And the cultural, exactly, science is a method, but that people think of it as a discipline is dangerous. And like with culture, we need to train people out of thinking race as being a culture, and we need to train people out of science as being a discipline. Science is a methodology. It's a means by which to get the best possible answers. The thing is, when you're dealing with complex systems like biology and social sciences and psychology, there's a huge diversity, and there's a lot of variables you can't control for. Because you can control for those variables in physics and in chemistry, they're very concrete. You get very concrete results. Not so much in social sciences, so you have to go, okay, Was it a screw up as a study? Is there another study I can do to prove that this is actually more accurate? So you're not going to get a really concrete proof for what you're talking about. But with the advent of artificial intelligence, we're going to get new tools to actually validate some of these premises. And we've already validated a few of the premises. There's a study called Tit for Tat. And basically it was saying, what is the best strategy for human behavior? And basically, tit for tat with forgiveness. Now, not always forgiving, but sometimes forgiving. So this, we were able, it has been demonstrated that there are strategies that you can show that are better than others. So, yeah. So I'm looking at this paper, I'm thinking to myself, my primary objective here was to talk about that thing there, white supremacist culture. And there is no such thing as a white supremacist culture. Let's just throw that away. That's not just a bad idea. It's derogatory. It can only be seen as derogatory. I'd love someone to defend the concept that we live in a white supremacist culture. It's so toxic. You know, it really took me back when I saw it, when it was sent to me as a handout. So, that is what I'm arguing against. And I honestly don't believe a lot of people are willing to put their foot down on something like black culture to say that's a bad idea, we shouldn't encourage it. I mean, it is racism. It is fundamentally racism to say that a culture is based on the color of somebody's skin. Now, I don't believe white privilege is not supremacist. Was the interesting. Privilege is, let's talk about privilege, because privilege is something that bothers me, but at the same time I'm trying to be fair with the idea. Right. Okay, now there was a BuzzFeed article about the oppression Olympics, and they had people say, did you have running water? Take a step forward. If you didn't, take a step back. So they had this this oppression Olympics done for it, and I forget what it was called. Yes, right, affirmative action. But affirmative action is racist, but it's racist against the people that are trying to be affirmed. The way I look at it is this: it's not that I don't want people to have chances in life. It's that I don't want people to feel like they got something they didn't deserve or they didn't earn. That's worse, because then you have to wonder, well, did I get it because I earned it, or did I get it because of the color of my skin? Did I get it because I'm a woman? Did I get it? I mean, why don't you want fair competition? I mean, if you've ever played a sport and you've gotten really into this sport, you want to win. You don't want to be given the game. You don't want the person to retire. So it's like, it makes no sense that you would not want to be on a fair playing field. Now, I missed that one. I'm going to lower it back here. The benefit of inheritance in society, and sometimes we had a lost Japanese. Trying to read this here. We had a lost Japanese are treated better in Japan, Turkey are treated. In terms of different cultures, in terms of how, I mean, we treat other cultures a lot better than other cultures treat diverse cultures. So if you're white in China, I mean, you're going to be called the white devil. I think, as I heard one time, it's a great story. When I was working at AT&T, I guess it doesn't matter. This guy had been living in China, and he spoke perfect Mandarin. And he was on the bus one day, and the mother was saying to her daughter, "Oh, that's the white devil." And he turned to her and in perfect Mandarin said, "Do you really want to teach your child racist attitudes like that?" And, you know, that talk about a put down. But yeah, racial attitudes are kind of a universal. It's so easy for us to do that we actually sometimes probably forget that we're doing it. And developing those attitudes, the pervasiveness of white privilege, or the concept of when given a choice between sacrificing a black man or a white man, a white person will be willing to, that more times than not, they'll sacrifice the black man, right? So what's that about? Well, that's guilt. That's white guilt. I mean, that's sort of what we would define as kind of a white guilt. So what we feel we have privilege, therefore we need to take the sacrifice. So there, and that's partly why we don't engage in racial conversations, is because we don't feel we have the right to engage in the conversation, which is the reason why I am now engaged in that conversation, because I think that is racist to take that position, that because of the color of your skin you shouldn't take part in a very important conversation that affects us all. We are all affected by racism, and if you don't see that, then you're not looking. You don't want to understand what stereotypes do. Stereotypes exist because there's some truth to them, but if you want to overcome them, you have to acknowledge how they function. Now, stereotypes, traits, and the reason I'm thinking about that is you can see a correlation between a specific trait and a behavior, if you will, or a culture. So that's why we say black culture and we mean inner city culture, or we're probably should be more specific than we actually are. And that's what I'm afraid of, not making that distinction. So, you know, the average behavior of X, however we might do that, and that might be useful information, or it might just be problematic. Now that Lacey Green's a friend, we can use her terms. No, I'm just kidding. It's my favorite joke on Lacey Green. Green? See, it's not a green screen. It's a brown screen. Okay, I must be getting rummy. But I hope that makes sense to someone, and it's helpful. But think differently about racism than we've been the conversation. Don't be afraid to engage in the conversation. You don't need to be right. And if someone comes up with an idea and you don't understand, just say, "That's an interesting idea. I'd have to research that," or "You got something for me to think about in terms of that." There are genetic differences, and they may or may not be important in a specific case. Do you believe capital acquisition should be limited? Capital acquisition should be limited in any sense. That's a trick question. I don't think you can actually. You're dealing with a complex organic system when we're talking about an economic environment. we need regulations that encourage development of new technology, not necessarily competition. But you're going to limit things in terms of how you do. Any policy is going to have an effect on the economy one way or the other. And it was this coal policy that Trump is trying to put through. I know there's a guy, Epstein, is a big proponent of coal and oil and how energy does a lot for us. Oh, okay. Diversification of no. But the question isn't whether it's good. The question is how do you distribute? Yeah. Well, yes, and that's part of the equation here. Is when you look at inventiveness, people that are willing to put their money in to where their mouth is. You know, they're willing to invest real money into problems. There's advantages. Okay, there's advantages in terms of putting the money where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. You know, is a bureaucracy the most effective way of solving a specific problem? Now, I follow a guy called Peter Diamandis. He's a transhumanist. And one thing, it's a really stupid thing to say, but it's something we need to remind ourselves constantly. You get what you incentivize. So from a governmental standpoint, if you have policies that disincentivize a behavior, you are going to get a specific, you're going to get a result no matter what you do. And in some ways you have to be able to adjust those incentives, whether it's how you use spectrum for communication. You don't want to have someone buy up all the spectrum and then not use it. So you want to make sure that there's an incentive to use it, that it can't. You be very careful about how you use regulations to even the field. In some ways, I think you should look at government as a business in that it should have goals in mind, what it wants to achieve, just like any other business. But those goals might be more geared towards health of the population, education of the population, productivity of the population, happiness of the population. Those might be goals of government, which won't necessarily be the same goal of a business, and you won't necessarily want those goals. Okay, so now we got to get back to the gaps. Now, I forget who said it. We have a problem with giving people money because people will spend it. So some programs have been suggested even by conservatives, you know, in terms of our welfare programs, at least in the United States. He was like, well, just give them money, then they'll learn how to spend money. So we can't be so afraid of giving people money and because they're going to spend it in ways that we don't agree with. So there's a certain sense of recycling the money. You know, it's like you need to recycle that money. If you have too much money at top, you need to find a way to recycle it into the lowest, because everyone kind of benefits from it. Able to become more productive and output useful investment items. The gaps close. What I mean. Okay, I see. Okay, if poverty-stricken part of the world, inventions intended in computers, they would be more. Yeah. Okay, I'm trying to fill out what you're doing, King. What you're doing here. Countries were able to become more productive, output useful inventions, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Now, I was in Peru, And one of the things that struck me about Peru, if you want to invest, really good place to invest. I think they got the picture, but it's going to take them time to learn, to unthink some of their habits. And the example I give is of carpenters. Their tools suck, and carpenters aren't appreciated. But a society that appreciates their carpenters is going to do really well. And if you look at how the trades, in terms of their wages, in terms of real wages, compared to like a school teacher or whatever, it's literally because the risk that that manufacturing and building has. It's the value that they actually bring into the economy. When you devalue the trades, the whole economy actually suffers. And a lot of the problems in Peru is that their trade, they don't have a trade union. They don't necessarily need a trade union. But if you increase their salary, everyone benefits, and the quality of work goes up because they use really cheap material and they use really cheap labor because it's so devalued. If you increase the value of the carpenter, meaning you pay him more, then you will say, well, it's worth investing in better material so I don't have to bring the carpenter out so much, right? So there's a trade-off. So in Peru, they don't value the carpenter, so they don't give the carpenter good materials. The carpenter can't afford good tools, so the job is shoddy often, and they just sort of limp along. Now in Lima, this is changing, but the values we have in the West and in the United States in terms of valuing the work of the trades, I mean, a tradesman makes quite a bit of money in comparison to, you know, a professor. I mean, often a tradesman can make more than a professor at a college, and that's not a bad thing because it helps the economy in general. And so back to the question of, you know, how do you distribute wealth? Are we valuing all the things we should value? Teacher cops. Well, that goes back, are we valuing the things we should value? And I think there is things that we do that have value that we aren't getting paid for. An example, classic example, is parenting. Instead of telling women they should go in the workforce, shouldn't we pay women to do a job that's very important, or pay a man to stay at home and do a job that's very important? So we're devaluing parenting by telling women that that job's not important. You need a man's job because only man's jobs are important. Women should have more babies. Yeah. How do you incentivize women to have more babies? How do you make that job that many women want to do more desirable that they do? And that's my point, is how are you valuing those things? And the reason I say you can't be afraid to give people money is because, but you want bang for your buck, right? More babies is not moral. Okay. The baby conundrum. That all depends on what you think about how large of a population we can have. Now, I'm of the school of thought that we haven't even scratched the surface of maximum population. Plus, I have self-interest in that. I want babies of my moral value. And when I see babies that don't have my moral value, meaning families that don't have my moral values, it's degrading my moral standing because there aren't enough people that are having kids of my morals. By the way, I said that wrong. But what's interesting about that is if you think about population, we have this attitude that we're going to run out of space. We're going to have to learn to use the space we do have more efficiently, but we have plenty of room to grow quite nicely. You know, Elon Musk is a good example. He has 5 kids. Why? Because he believes in a bright future. So we've been selling this oppressive ideology of, well, there's not enough room on the planet. We need to rein back. And so this is kind of an oppressive ideology. And in this very socialistic document, they're concerned about this progress, this idea that we can't progress more. The truth of the matter, we most definitely can. Nanotechnology, we haven't even begun that whole evolution of technology, and well, not the molecular nanotechnology that one day, I don't know how soon, but eventually we'll get there. There's also transhumanism. I mean, where people will be augmenting their bodies and becoming new people. What kind of resources will they need? What kind of resources will they want? Well, we'll optimize people to live in space. So we don't really know. Do you know what the future is going to look like? And why would you inhibit at this point people? People are good because we need people to pay for all the buildings we've created. You still need an influx of new people. I mean, some of these Western cultures have been so anti-children that, you know, one child per household or less. This is really a bad attitude about the importance of family. It's been very inhibitive. And actually, the Catholic Church has documents about just the effects of what you can look at abortion and what, you know, having, I wouldn't say pro-abortion policy, but it's very close to pro-abortion policies. You know, don't have kids are not important. Yes, exactly. A lot of, King pointed out, a lot of countries are not beyond replacement level. And that should concern you. It's like, that's kind of a bad attitude, really, about the future. And that's the message that we're projecting. And so there's another example of feedback cycle. We are encouraging women to do work that men have traditionally done, and because we have told them this is what's important. Is that a positive thing to do? I don't think so. I think these are really negative things to do. And it's not that I think people, if you want a specific job and you want to do it, that's great. I mean, I think there should be opportunities for you, but you shouldn't be punished because you want to raise a family. We don't really have a system that encourages parenting. We say, well, when you have enough money, well, why wouldn't that be like a parenting track? Why wouldn't we have encouragement for parenting? Reward good parenting, demonstrate good parenting. There's all kinds of things. And if you look at one of the most problematic areas of inner city culture, it's that we are encouraging single family homes by the regressive, what do we call that? Welfare system. I mean, you're not encouraging a woman to have a man in the house. If the man's in the house, well, you got to get money from the man. So it's discouraging men to be in the house instead of looking at, well, how can we help that? How can we help you make that work? Yeah, through subsidizing single-family homes. What is that your goal? Is to make women dependent on the welfare state? I mean, is that what we want to do? Another thing is when someone's fairly successful, we punish their income to the point that we push them back into a very uncomfortable position, not allowing them to have, you know, encouraging some sort of savings. Like, you can put money into an emergency savings fund up to a certain point. Once you reach that savings fund, if you have that funded, and we'll let you do that, then we'll cut you off. But only until you have that savings fund. So encouraging saving for, you know, emergencies. So we're not teaching good economic thinking. There's a variety of things. Once you're invested in, once you're trying to help somebody, you're kind of invested into their success, and you should be measured on the success and failures. Now, a lot of people will point out that most people don't stay on welfare very long, and you don't want to encourage that for sure. But different people have different needs, and if someone is a chronic welfare recipient, then you want to look at the specifics of why they are, and don't simply say it's their fault. Take responsibility for the fact that you're encouraging a specific behavior. You can't help if you put a cast on someone's leg, their muscles are going to atrophy. So there has to be a process of rehabilitation once you take the cast off. And there's no sort of organic thinking about how a welfare state would actually work. I'm not opposed to programs to help people, because ultimately what you want is to maximize the potential for everyone. What is their maximum potential? And maybe you could honestly say, you've kind of reached your maximum potential. These are the things that are most likely to be successful. Now, if you want to strive for this upper, this 4-year degree or this type of job, that would be good. But what we don't often do is manage people to manage their expectations in a positive, constructive manner. So they say, well, do whatever you want to do, instead of, now this is, it's a case by case. It's a social workers, and some social workers are very good and they help people manage their expectations and their goals effectively. Others probably do not. Social sciences is really important, and that's one of the problems we face in society, is very this oppressed view of social science. It's not important. When we should have been criticizing social science, we weren't. And that's the problem Christina Hoff Sommers had. When she finally looked at social science, she realized that they had created their own echo chamber where they didn't have to receive criticism, because the job of social science is a lot more difficult in a lot of ways than physics. And they wanted it easy because they weren't getting respect. So it's complicated in that respect, and I don't expect people to interrelated with the happiness of his fellow man. Yep. I came to Adam Smith. I used to play ping pong, and a lot of the ping pong players I used to play at colleges were conservative ping pong players, and they used to challenge me on my liberal values, and Adam Smith was often trumpeted out there, and they'd say, well, Adam Smith said this, and at first I really resented it, but I was like, well, that makes sense. I mean, what he's saying. So instead of assuming because it came from Adam Smith that it was a bad idea, I just, at a very young age, I listened to the ideas and not the source. I tried to understand the idea, because often I would recreate people's ideas just through the thinking process. So a lot of my original ideas were created, because being a dyslexic, I wasn't a good reader, so I'd have to recreate a lot of these ideas. And I remember in high school I was talking to a professor, and he was kind of mentoring me at the time, and I'd be talking about this stuff. He says, yeah, that's the philosopher blah blah blah. I said, but I never read that guy. He says, well, you thought about it, just what he did. And that's the thing I realized at a very young age. If you think about something and you seriously think about it, you'll probably generate something that someone else has already thought about. Now, we all like coming up with original ideas, and I think it's a good thing to try to do, but a lot of times we'll recreate the same idea that someone else had. And it's fun, though, occasionally to see that someone else came up with that idea and say, well, wow, that makes sense. But it sort of feels like you sort of own that idea. And one of the things I do see a lot of people not doing is owning ideas. We're too quick to give other people credit for it, instead of the fact that you may have worked very hard to come up with the same idea. And to own it isn't necessarily to steal it, because really, it's the work. Did you do the work? Did you get in there and did you think about it? Did you work out the problems? So, yeah, I appreciate the work that someone would go into. I use Immanuel Kant as a person that, I look at his writing in terms of his workmanship. Now they're kind of messed up in terms of complicated prose, but you can look at some of the stuff that he did that had really just a lot of work and a lot of thought went into it, and that's fun to see. And you can see the process that he went through, or any philosopher might have gone through. But yeah. Well, I think this will be it for my live stream right now, unless there's any other questions. It's been a slow go, but it was fun. But yeah, I got that off the table here. Just remember, there's no such thing as white supremacist culture, and there's no such thing as black culture. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out with me for a bit.